All right, well, you may have noticed we've made this transition from going through all these different species and groups and diversity, and we're on to looking at the biology of sharks and skates and rays, particular these different aspects of their biology that related to morphology or physiology, reproduction, that explain their success for the most part. And so today is the first lecture in 2 parts looking at osmoregulation. So these are the things we're going to talk about today: is what osmoregulation is, what does it mean to live in the ocean and have water and salt balance, what kind of challenges do you have if you're a marine organism or an aquatic organism or a terrestrial organism for that part. And then we're going to look at some basics, not go into that much detail, but a little review will be helpful when we look at water and osmotic concentrations and factors that are going to influence whether an organism is gaining water or losing water. And then finally, patterns of osmoregulation, specifically towards elasmobranchs, sharks, skates, and rays, but comparing them with other marine organisms or fish as well. So first of all, you've got 2 fluids, basically. You've got fluids in an organism, like a shark or skate or ray, and you've got fluids in the media in which they're found, the ocean. And the ocean has a certain composition of water and salts and other things. And the body of an organism has a composition of fluids. Now, you can break up the fluids in an organism into different things. You can talk about the fluid that's in a cell, and you can talk about the fluid that's in the body, in between the cells, or sometimes in the blood. So there's a number of different fluids within organisms. But if you look at the organism in general and compare that with the composition of fluids in the ocean, then you get an idea of what kind of exchange is taking place. That's what's being regulated, is exchange of water and salts and other materials between an organism and its environment. And in this case, the organisms are sharks and skates and rays, and the environment is the ocean. So that is what is going to be regulated, are ions, salts, chloride, sodium, potassium, those kind of things, and water, the exchange of those with the environment. So if you talk about the ocean, the second topic, what is the ocean in terms of its composition? The ocean, it's changed over the years, obviously, in terms of when it was first formed and the salts that made up the ocean and those kind of things. But for millions of years now, the concentration of sodium and chloride, potassium and calcium and magnesium and a number of different ions especially has been fairly constant. If you go around in the ocean, there's different salinities. You know, if you look at the Atlantic versus the Pacific and Indian, and with the influx of fresh water different places, then obviously the concentration of those ions changes. But for the most part, in a lot of the ocean, a huge amount of the ocean, these chemicals, these elements, ions, in other words, these charged elements, the concentration has been relatively constant. And spatially, it's relatively constant. You've got a huge amount of the ocean where the concentration of those ions is similar. That's the environment that we're talking about in terms of where these sharks and skates and rays live. And for most sharks and skates and rays, then the ocean is a relatively constant osmotic environment. Along the edges, of course, where there's fresh water, or you've got these different species that move into fresh water, or they're in bays or estuaries, then you're going to have some changes, and it's going to be more dynamic than the majority of the ocean. But if you look at the concentration of water in the ocean, or another way of looking at it is if you look at the dissolved substances in the ocean, and you represent that as an osmolarity, then The osmolarity of seawater is about 1100 milliosmoles. Now, it may not make much sense to you what that is right now, but that's basically a measurement of the amount of dissolved solutes in the ocean. You know, water is a good solvent. You know, there's a lot of different substances in the ocean besides NaCl. There's a lot of other things. We'll get to what osmolarity is, or what osmotic concentration is. But that's the ocean. Those are the ions that are there. But that's the concentration of those ions, and as a result of that, that's the salinity that you find in typical parts of the ocean, about 34 to 35 parts per thousand. So what challenges does an organism have that lives in the ocean? Well, first of all, inside of cells, there's a requirement to have a particular set of environmental conditions for cells to function optimally, for biochemical pathways to take place, for biochemical reactions to take place, for a cell to do what it needs to do and to carry out the processes that are necessary for life. Then there's got to be certain conditions that are met and maintained relatively stable. You guys know that as homeostasis, and recognize that that's an important aspect of the biology of a lot of organisms, is that the internal composition of an organism is relatively constant, or they maintain homeostasis. So if you look at the concentration of those things in seawater, sodium, chloride, potassium, seawater has a certain concentration of each one of those ions. If you look at the concentration of those same ions inside of the cell or inside of the body fluid of a marine organism, they're different from one another. And because they're different and they're separated by cell membrane or they're separated by skin, then you've got fluid on one side of this barrier, whether that's skin or the cell membrane, and you've got fluid on the other side. And there's a gradient that favors movement of those substances down a concentration gradient into a cell or out of a cell. It depends on what the gradient is favoring. So if you look at cell membranes, if you think about the past classes that you've had where you've looked at cell membranes, then a lot of these ions are charged and they don't pass easily across cell membranes. Cell membranes are nonpolar, they're lipid. And so you've got this situation where those ions don't move freely across the cell membrane, or at least they don't tend to unless they're helped. Water, on the other hand, moves freely across the cell membranes, and the direction that water moves into a cell or out of a cell, into an organism or out of an organism, is influenced by the solute concentration. So this is the challenge that marine organisms like sharks and skates and rays have, is to maintain that balance of water and ions so that their cells can function properly. So what do you do if you're living in the ocean? If you've got a body and you've got cells that exchange materials, and you want to be able to regulate exchange of these materials, you want to keep a certain amount of water and you want to keep the proper concentration of salts. You don't want too much salt, you don't want too little, you don't want too much water, you don't want too little water. Well, what kind of things do organisms do? Marine organisms, and including sharks and skates and rays. Well, one of the things that you can do is decrease the cell permeability, the solutes. So these solutes, they can pass down a concentration gradient, but even then sometimes that movement is not facilitated because of the lipid bilayer, that these charged substances don't pass easily through a lipid environment. So their permeability is reduced, and different cell membranes of different organisms have different permeabilities to different ions. Another thing you can do is, if these substances, water and the ions themselves, move down a concentration gradient, and that's what's powering the movement from high to low, you can minimize the difference in the concentration gradient. So you can have the inside of an organism or the inside of a cell, similar concentration to the outside, and then the concentration gradient isn't so strong, and the forces driving an ion into or out of a cell, the forces driving water into or out of a cell aren't as great. That's another approach that you can take. And a third thing, and this is what organisms do all the time, they expend a huge amount of energy. We'll see that there's a difference in how much energy bony fish expend and marine mammals expend and sharks and skates and rays expend in this number 3 here, which is, there's 2 number 3s. It's actually just one number 3. They actively transport solutes. So organisms expend a lot of energy. In fact, all this food that you take in as a marine organism that contains energy, a lot of that energy gets expended to do this very thing, number 3, to actively transport solutes across the membrane, to maintain a certain composition that's good for the cells and allows the organism to survive. It's expensive energetically, and it takes a lot of energy that organisms consume. That's where this energy is channeled towards, is this osmoregulation. It's an expensive thing for some species, some organisms, some major groups of animals. So if you look at sharks, and skates, and rays, if you look at a number of other fish, if you look at dolphins and turtles and manatees and things, they do all 3 of these things. So that's what we're going to look at here. And so you've got to regulate this internal environment. You've got to have a body composition that favors survival. You've got to have a composition of cells that are going to allow those cells to carry out the functions that they do optimally. You don't want to suboptimal conditions by having not enough water, or too much water, or too many solutes, or not enough solutes. You need these different things. So the regulation part of this comes about in the fact that there's a lot of changes that take place to cells, and there's a lot of changes that take place to the body fluids of an organism as a result of their daily lives. So for instance, there's gradients between the fluid that's outside of a cell and a fluid that's inside of a cell. Those gradients drive the movement of substances one way or the other a lot of times. And so another factor is the surface to volume ratio. The exchange site where water is being exchanged and ions are being exchanged is the body surface of an organism. So the surface to volume ratio, how much surface area there is that's in contact with seawater compared to the volume of the animal, has an influence on how quickly things move. And depending on the surface to volume ratio, then some osmotic regulations or osmoregulation is easier than others. Another factor is how permeable the skin is, or the integument. There's some organisms that have parts of their body that are pretty impermeable to the movement of substances, and there's a lot of the body where the permeability isn't regulated very much. Another thing, obviously changing the composition of body fluids, is when you feed. You eat some fish, you take in some salt water along with that fish, you ingest it, your intestines are absorbing salt water. There's changes to the composition of your body fluids, your blood, and you want to reduce it, but potentially even to your cells, just by feeding and taking in a bunch of solutes and water sometimes. You could include drinking as well if these organisms drink. Another thing that is experienced by organisms as they're living their daily lives are temperature changes. So in some cases, you might be in an environment where water moves more quickly, or there's more dissolved substances, or it affects a lot of aspects of the biology of organisms, but temperature can influence osmotic changes or osmoregulation and other things. Another thing is metabolic factors. You need water for different processes. You need to get rid of a certain amount of water because you're using that to get rid of nitrogenous wastes. We eat protein, marine animals eat protein, sharks eat protein. All of those proteins, as you guys probably all know, have nitrogen in them. You've got to get rid of those nitrogenous wastes, and you have to use a certain amount of water to get rid of those. So you take in a bunch of protein, get rid of those nitrogenous wastes. That influences the amount of water you have in your body. So there's all these different factors. This is just a short list. It's not even a comprehensive list of ways that your osmotic concentration in your body fluids and even in your cells can be changed. This is what you have to regulate. You're experiencing all of these changes all the time as a marine organism, and so you've got to compensate for these changes. All right, well, let's look not in that much detail, but this will help understand what sharks and skates and rays and bony fish are doing in their environment and what's powering the movement of ions or water in their bodies. So let's just look at some basics in terms of transport of substances into or out of an organism or into or out of cells. Well, water moves freely across cell membranes. Water moves pretty freely into and out of organisms. And water moves down its concentration gradient. So where there's a high concentration of water, it's going to move down its concentration gradient into an organism, into a cell, whatever it's moving across, until there's an equilibrium. That's osmosis, diffusion. These water molecules are moving around, and so most organisms have very little control over the movement of water. This water is just going to move whichever direction that gradient is favoring. Organisms have a hard time stopping water from moving in or out of their body or in or out of their cells. The cells are permeable to water. The skin is pretty permeable to water. So those exchanges with water take place a lot. Well, water is a good solvent. You guys all remember this from some biology class where water is polar. It's got a charged part, it's got negative and positive parts. It dissolves things very well. And so, not surprisingly, in the ocean, there's this long list of substances that are dissolved in seawater. Sodium and chloride are the two most common, and then sulfate and magnesium and calcium and all these different substances are found in seawater because water dissolves things very well. If you look inside of cells, it's the same thing. Water is a good solvent. So there's a bunch of ions that are in cells. There's other materials that are in cells. And so the more substances that are dissolved in water, then the less water there is. These water molecules get displaced by these dissolved substances. So if you've got a lot of dissolved substances, the water concentration is going to be lower. If you have just a very few dissolved substances, then that fluid is going to be almost all pure water, very high concentration of water and a very low concentration of solutes. Those things influence the movement of water into a cell or out of a cell, into an organism or out of an organism. So it's basically that all these different dissolved substances are altering not just the influence of, or not just the concentration of those substances, but they're influencing the concentration of water itself. The more dissolved solutes that you have, well, that's what a solute is dissolved substance, then the less water you're going to have, really. And so you can look at the concentration of sodium or chloride or hydrogen or something, oxygen. You can express the concentration of some substance in a certain amount of water. So for instance, if you look at a liter of water, how much chloride is there? How much potassium is there? Those kind of things. You can express that as an osmotic concentration, or in the old days known as osmolarity, sometimes osmolality, but really it just represents the concentration of solutes that are dissolved in a set amount of water. That's the osmotic concentration, represented by osmoles, osmolarity. Or since some of these concentrations are very small, then it's more common a lot of times to represent them as milliosmoles, because if you just use osmoles, it would be a tiny little number. So that's what osmolarity is. Osmolarity is basically an old term referring to osmotic concentration. So for instance, you put some salt into water and the salt ionizes, or the sodium and chloride break apart. You put that in 1 liter of water to make 1 mole of sodium and 1 mole of chloride. Then the concentration of dissolved substances, it's a combination of these two salts, sodium and chloride. But the osmolarity, or the osmotic concentration, is 2 osmoles. And again, a lot of times you wouldn't talk about osmoles, but you'd be talking about milliosmoles. If you're talking about glucose, you put 1 mole of glucose and dissolve that in water, and then you've got 1 osmole of glucose. That's what the concentration is. And as I said, a lot of times you've got these tiny little concentrations, and it doesn't make that much sense to say that the osmotic concentration is 0.005 osmoles. It makes more sense that you'd express that as 50 milliosmoles or something like that. It's more of an integer rather than these tiny little fractions. So milliosmoles is more common. You see that more common than osmoles. Okay, well, let's look at these fluids that you find in sharks and skates and rays. You've got fluids inside of cells, intracellular fluid, ICF. You've got fluid in between the cells, in your body, but not in cells. That's extracellular fluid, ECF. It's in the body, between the cells. And then the third fluid that we're talking about when we're looking at these substances move is seawater. So each one of those fluids is going to have its own osmotic concentration. We're going to look at these 3 fluids and say, okay, we already looked at this quite a while ago. The osmotic concentration of seawater is 1100 milliosmoles, a typical seawater concentration of solutes. So we're also going to look at the osmotic concentration within cells and within the body fluid of sharks and skates and rays. And then when we're done with sharks and skates and rays, we're going to look at bony fish to see what kind of osmotic concentrations they have in their cells. That's one fluid. In their extracellular fluid, that's another fluid. And how those compare to seawater, which is the third fluid. So maybe I went too fast. You could go back and read that, all that text there. But we're going to be looking at 2 different fluids. And as I said, the concentration of water in those 2 different fluids is going to determine which direction water goes. The concentration of solutes in those 2 fluids influences the concentration of water, but also influences the direction that those solutes move. These things are going to move down a concentration gradient. For water, there's little or no barrier to its movement into or out of an organism, into or out of a cell. For these ions, there can be a big impediment to their movement, either across the integument, the skin, or even more across the cell membrane. So let's look at this idea of comparing the osmotic concentration of 2 fluids. If you're talking about the osmotic concentration of an organism and the ocean, you can compare which one has more water, or in other words, which one has a higher concentration of dissolved substances or solutes. If they're the same, if the body fluid of an organism is about 1100 and the concentration of solutes in the ocean is about 1100, they're the same osmotic concentration. That's an isosmotic condition. So it depends on which one you're referring to in terms of the other one. But if you're talking about the body fluids of an organism, then you could say the body fluids of this organism are isosmotic with the ocean. If you have a lower osmotic concentration in the body fluid, or in other words, if you have fewer solutes that are dissolved in the body fluid than in the ocean, and the concentration of water is higher in the body fluids versus the ocean, then you would say that these body fluids are hypoosmotic compared to the ocean. There's less solutes in the body fluids than there are in the ocean. And then the opposite condition, where there's a higher concentration of solutes in the body fluids, is hyperosmotic. Now, you could be talking about the ocean instead of the body fluids, in which case it would be the other way around, that you'd say if there's a higher concentration of solutes in the ocean, then you'd say the ocean is hyperosmotic to the body fluids. But usually it's the body fluids or the cell that's being referenced to whatever fluid it's in. It's the organism that's hyperosmotic or hypoosmotic. So here's some hypotonic. You see there's hardly any solutes in the water, and there's a lot more in the body fluids. Here's isotonic, equal concentration of solutes in both. And then hypertonic, far fewer solutes in the body fluid than there are in the ocean. Well, if you look at the concentration of solutes in the body fluids of marine organisms, then you find some different patterns of osmoregulation. We're not quite to that topic, but you've got a lot of marine organisms, especially invertebrates, that they don't bother osmoregulating very much. The concentration of solutes in their body fluid and the concentration of water in their body fluid is just, it's determined by the passive movement of water for the most part, and some with these ions. But in the end, you've got a body fluid that's pretty much the same as the concentration of solutes as in seawater. These don't go to that much trouble to regulate their body fluids. Their body fluids are just similar for the most part to the ocean. Now, if you looked in their cells, it would be a different situation. Their cells, they're going to expend energy. Their cells, they're not just going to let their cells be whatever the concentration of solutes are in the ocean, because that's going to throw off all those processes that are taking place inside of cells. If you look at most fishes, and in fact most marine vertebrates, the amount of solutes in their body fluids, that's sodium and chloride and these other things, is a fraction of what you find in seawater. So if you express this as milliosmoles, for instance, then the body fluids of a fish, a marine bony fish, would be about 300 milliosmoles. It's not a very high concentration of solutes. Whereas the concentration of solutes in the ocean is about 1100 milliosmoles. So the ocean is very high concentration of solutes compared to body fluids. So again, if you're relating the concentration, osmotic concentration of body fluids to the ocean, those body fluids are hypoosmotic compared to the ocean. These vertebrates in the ocean are strict regulators. They go to a lot of trouble. They expend a lot of energy, spend a lot of the food that they intake and the energy that they derive from the food goes towards this osmoregulation. They're strict osmoregulators, and their body fluids don't vary with the osmotic concentration of the ocean, even if they're even experiencing different osmotic concentrations of seawater. they expend a lot of energy, and this concentration of solutes of about 300 milliosmoles is very constant. And so they're constantly in this state of being hypoosmotic. So what that means is inside the body fluids of a marine bony fish, there's a lot fewer solutes. And on the corollary of that means that there's a lot more water, a high concentration of water in their body fluids, a low concentration of water in the ocean. That may sound kind of strange since the ocean is water, but because of the concentration of solutes, there's more water. The concentration of water in their body fluids is higher than the concentration of water in the ocean, and they're constantly losing water. Water is moving down its concentration gradient out of their bodies. If you look at elasmobranchs, sharks, skates, and rays, what we're going to see is if you looked at all the different substances that were dissolved in their body fluids, you've got the 300 milliosmoles that are made up of similar things that you find in bony fish, which is mostly sodium and potassium, chloride, those kind of things, add up to 300 or 400 milliosmoles. However, there's all these other things that are dissolved in the body fluids of sharks and skates and rays, and primarily those things are nitrogenous wastes. So they've got a certain concentration of salt, sodium, chloride, potassium, but they augment that concentration with these nitrogenous wastes. Instead of expelling them from their body all the time like bony fish do, they store them in their body. And what that does is it brings the osmotic concentration of their body fluids up higher. It goes from 300, 400, 500, 600, all the way up to over 1,000 milliosmoles, close to 1,100 milliosmoles. And the result of that is that the osmotic concentration of their body fluids is similar to the osmotic concentration of seawater, and these sharks and skates and rays are isosmotic with seawater. And so they're not constantly losing water. So one more thing about this movement of water across cell membranes and into and out of the body. So if you're talking about vertebrates, then this extracellular fluid out here it doesn't look like this. This is a typical marine invertebrate, where an osmoconformer, where if you looked at this is a cell here that's got a different concentration of solutes. See, this chloride is only 100 and the fluid is 500, sodium, potassium. So the outside of a cell is very different than the inside of a cell, but for marine invertebrates, if you look at the composition, chloride and sodium, potassium, calcium, they're very similar inside of an organism, not inside the cells, but inside of a marine invertebrate than outside. If you looked at a fish, this is not going to look like this, a bony fish. This osmotic concentration is going to be more like 300 because there's not very much chloride, sodium, less calcium and potassium. This is a fraction of what you find in marine invertebrates. So if you're a marine invertebrate in this situation, you can see there's going to be an equal exchange. Water's not going to come in, it's not going to go out, it's going to be equal. So they're osmotic conformers or osmoconformers, whereas the vertebrates, this is going to be 300, which is very different from this. And there's more water here because there's less solutes, and this water is constantly moving out of the organism. Their cells are a whole different matter, that they're spending a lot of time and energy to regulate. So that may be kind of a long-winded preamble to the situation that we're going to look at now. We're going to look at, you've got the inside of a cell with its composition, you've got the body fluid with its composition, and then you've got the ocean. So what does that all mean in terms of movement of these substances? Well, this is what's going on in terms of exchange. Here's a figure that shows the inside of cells. This is the inside of cells. There's exchange between cells and this brownish area, which is the extracellular fluid. This is inside the body of the organism, but it's not inside their cells. So there's some things come into cells, some things go out of cells. Now here's the integument, or the skin of this organism, and here's the ocean, this white part. So there's things that come in and leave the body that are exchanged with the ocean. There's a separate and different exchange between the extracellular fluid and cells, and this is highly regulated even in marine invertebrates, osmoconformers. But these are the sites of exchange between the extracellular fluid and the ocean, and between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. These movement of these substances, if they're passive, then that's one thing. If you're an osmoconformer, that's one thing. Although they have to expend energy here with these exchanges to osmoregulate. But in terms of the body fluids, if you're a fish, a marine fish, then you expend a lot of energy to move things in and out. And it's energetically costly, and it's a high proportion of their metabolic rate, actually. Okay, well, for aquatic animals, then they've got to do three things in terms of osmoregulation for the most part. They have to have a certain amount of water to be able to function properly. And again, in the ocean, you think, well, what's the problem in the ocean? There's water everywhere, but there's a higher concentration of water inside the body fluids than in the ocean, so you tend to lose water all the time. Well, to get that water, all you have to do is drink. But you're drinking seawater with all kinds of solutes rather than fresh water. You've got to deal with those solutes once you get them into your body. The water is fine. You've got water, but you've got a bunch of salt as well, because you're not drinking fresh water, you're drinking salt water. The other thing is, just what I was alluding to, just what I was talking about, is it's not just water balance, but it's solute balance. Sure, if you're a marine organism, you can drink seawater, but you're getting salt water. You're getting salt, not just water. So now you've got to get rid of all those salts. You've also got to regulate nutrients back and forth. You can eat things to get those into your body. So that's what you need, is the balance of solutes: sodium, chloride, potassium, magnesium, calcium. And the other thing that you have to do in terms of osmoregulation and your excretory systems, this is one of the things that excretory systems were evolved for, was to rid the body of nitrogenous wastes. When you're breaking down protein, when you're breaking down nucleic acids, every protein has amino acids, every amino acid has nitrogen. So there's all this nitrogen that's built up. You have to get rid of that nitrogen. So we're going to look at sharks and skates and rays in terms of how they osmoregulate, how they solve these three problems, or how they accomplish these three necessities. And then we're going to look at bony fish in the ocean. We're going to look at bony fish in freshwater. We're going to look at marine mammals, might as well. So a long time ago, millions and millions of years ago, early animals, pretty primitive animals, started developing excretory systems. It was an early advance in terms of evolution. And these excretory systems, like I said, they balance water, they balance salt, and they're able to rid the body of nitrogenous wastes. That's what these excretory systems do. And so there's this pattern of tubular excretory systems where you filter the body fluid, or blood in some cases if you have a circulatory system. You filter that fluid, and it goes from the body fluid into some tube. That tube is the excretory system. Or it goes, we're familiar with this because this is what happens in our bodies, is you don't filter the body fluid, you filter blood. In our kidneys, a lot of blood is filtered, and then you have this fluid that just a second ago was blood, but it's been filtered and now it enters into these tubes. Those tubes eventually meet up with the kidneys, or they're in the kidneys, and that's where these fluids that are eventually going to become urine and be excreted from the body, but that's where this fluid is formed and modified. It could be filtration of the body fluid in more primitive animals or animals that don't have a closed circulatory system, or in the case of vertebrates, then it's blood that's filtered, and this excretory organ that does all this is the kidney. We're familiar with kidneys because we have kidneys ourselves. So what the kidney does, first of all, filters body fluid or blood. In the case of these vertebrates that we're talking about now, it's not the body fluid that's filtered, it's blood that's filtered. Our kidneys have millions and millions of tiny little capillaries that deliver a huge amount of blood. That blood is filtered, and the effluent, the filtrate, is what eventually becomes urine and that we excrete from our bodies, or the sharks excrete from their bodies, or fish excrete from their bodies. But as this fluid that was filtered from the blood passes through these tubes are lined with epithelial cells. These tubes are modifying the composition of that fluid by reabsorbing some things. There's something in that fluid, some substances in that fluid that are important to us and to sharks and skates and rays and to fish that they want to reabsorb. Water, for instance. You don't want to be excreting all kinds of water, especially if you're a bony fish and you're losing water all the time. Terrestrial animals retaining water in the kidneys is very important. So there's reabsorption of some things. Water is really big. Glucose is not something you want to excrete. Amino acids, you don't want to lose those. These ions like sodium and chloride and potassium and magnesium, now those, you don't want to have too much of those, but you need, sometimes you want to reabsorb those and keep them in your body, depending on the environment. And then there's waste products, nitrogenous waste for the most part, that's excreted into this fluid. The fluid leaves the body, and that fluid is full of nitrogenous waste. It could be uric acid, or it could be urea, or it could be ammonia. Those are all nitrogenous waste that organisms get rid of. So those are three functions of the vertebrate kidney. All right. Well, that's a good place to stop for this first lecture. It's not quite 50 minutes, but we'll give you a break this time because that last lecture was over 50 minutes. But here's a blacktip shark, very common along the U.S. East Coast, all the way down to South America. It's common on the West Coast. It's common in Hawaii. It's common at a number of islands. It's very common in Australia, all around the Indian Ocean. This is a very, very common inshore shark. Blacktip. They're very distinct in what they look like. They've got these black tips, and they're fairly fast moving. They don't get to be that big. They're not that dangerous. There's a lot of interactions with humans because there's so many of these close to shore, but a lot of it is, you know, that they get caught in fisheries, or people see these when they're diving, or even when they're out wading around. There's thousands of blacktips that are off the coast of Florida certain times of the year. And sometimes people get bit on the foot or something like that. It's not like they're biting off somebody's leg, but they feed on little fish. They see somebody's foot, it's white, think it's a fish. Not very good visibility in that water. Anyway, the blacktip shark. This is a carcharodonid, Carcharodoniformes. It's very, very common, and a species that people are familiar with in coastal waters all over the world. Okay, well, that'll be a good place to stop. We've got one more lecture when we come back from this kind of break on osmoregulation, and that's going to finish up Monday, October 29th. Talk about osmoregulation. In fact, finish talking about osmoregulation, where we'll look at how sharks, skates, and rays osmoregulate, how bony fish regulate in freshwater and seawater, and a little about other vertebrates.